is Audric Estime, the 0RB star of 2024. Is Jaden Daniels going to score touchdowns again? Can CJ Stroud turn it around with Nico Collins back? A lot of fun stuff to talk about from what we saw in Week 10 and what we'll see going forward. And that's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. We are here. We're recording on Wednesday morning for our first show of the week. We only did one last week in the end. We're going to try to do multiple this week. Apologies on all of that. But we are back. A lot of games, a lot of storylines to discuss. It wasn't the best week. It was a weird week. It was a weird week for my picks over at Stealing Lines. I noted when I was doing the picks that setting aside the Munich game, which was a neutral site, of all the ones that had home and away, there was, I think, 6 road favorites of at least like more than a field goal, like pretty sizable road favorites when you consider that the home teams tend to get a little bit of a boost. And what we saw was a lot of them didn't play particularly well. And the home team, you see why road favorites of 6 or 8 points can be tough bets in the betting space. I ended up not making a lot of bets last week. What I should have been doing was taking the home teams and taking the unders. So that's kind of the way that the week ended up actually playing out. In some of those spots, you had the Colts actually playing pretty well against the Bills. The Bills did cover. That's not a great example of it. The Saints winning outright over the Falcons, who were like 3.5-point road favorites. The Bucks covering against the 49ers, who do end up winning at the end, despite Jake Moody having previously missed 3 field goals. You have the Vikings not looking great, but going ahead and finally winning late against the Jaguars, who looked even worse. You have the Eagles are an example of one who actually just crushed as a road favorite. You do obviously sometimes see those home teams not necessarily show up when they're not great. Oh, the Jets were small road favorites against the Cardinals, got crushed. The Lions, another one. They were 3.5-point road favorites. They win by 3 again at the end.
Did you bet on that Cardinals game? I mean, every week we get new information. And the new information from that game is that the Cardinals are really on the upswing in a wide variety of facets, and that the Jets win over the Texans was partly a fluke and partly that the Texans are not actually very good. But, knowing that now, it feels very easy to go back and say this rising Cardinals team created a lot of problems for the New York Jets, that if they had played that game another 10 times, it doesn't feel like the Jets would have solved very quickly.
A really fascinating game because we talk about the possessions element, and I love to talk about how there's like 11 possessions in a game for both teams. This one was crazy. Can you guess how many possessions the Jets had in this game?
I'm trying to think of the different games. There was a game this week with 13 and 14, which jumped out to me as very interesting because I don't want to get us off the track of what you're talking about, but the weirdest set of stats for me this week in terms of both the issues for the Chiefs and just the weirdness of the week is that the Kansas City Chiefs had the same number of possessions as Sam Darnold and Jared Goff threw picks.
Help me understand that. Combined?
Right. So we had 8 possessions for the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah.
8 combined picks for Sam Darnold.
There you go. Goff. And eight possessions is low. I mean, I know it doesn't seem like it's that much lower than 11, but you think about over the course of a game, things do tend to normalize. You mentioned 13 and 14 as being particularly high. If you add 2 to 3 possessions over the average, it means that a lot has happened throughout the game. And so 8, those are those slow games where you only get 8 possessions. Shawn, the Jets had 6 possessions in this game.
Checking in here, 6 is what you would have gotten in a lot of quarters.
And certainly in halves.
Days where teams would throw some incompletions, would get up to the line and run some plays, and teams felt like stopping the run was a part of football.
Yeah. So what we got in this game is a fascinating game. The Cardinals get the ball first. They drive down, 70-yard touchdown drive. Pretty quick. Jets get the ball, 11-play, 63-yard field goal drive. They aren't able to get it in. Cardinals get it back, 70-yard touchdown drive. Took a little bit longer, but fairly easy. Touchdown drive for them again. Jets get it back, 12 plays, 6 minutes of game time, another field goal drive. Cardinals get it back, 70-yard touchdown drive. So the first 5 possessions were all pretty good possessions, even for the Jets, but the Cardinals got their way into the end zone on all 3. The Jets got stopped and had to kick field goals on 2, and pretty soon they take over in the second quarter, and they've actually moved the ball and gotten first downs on both of their drives and gotten down into scoring range, and they're down 21-6 because their defense has not been able to get the Cardinals off the field. The Cardinals have marched the full 70 yards and scored 3 straight touchdowns to open the game. The Jets go 3 and out there. The Cardinals get it back. They drive down a 10-play drive, kick a field goal as the first half expires. So they had 4 possessions in the first half, 3 touchdowns and a field goal. Jets only had 3 in the first half. They get the ball, Jets, to start the second half. They go 10 plays all the way down inside the 5. They technically lost this possession on a fumble, but it was a turnover on downs. It was a 4th and 3 where Rodgers ends up getting stripped. Either way, it was going to be a turnover. Long drive to a turnover on downs, essentially inside the 10. Cardinals come back, 88-yard touchdown drive. So their first 5 drives in this game are 3 70-yard touchdown drives, a field goal drive before half, and an 88-yard touchdown drive. Jets come back, they end up having to punt. But by this point, it's 28-6. The Jets have barely had the ball. They've had 3 pretty good drives, and they've had to settle for field goals and a turnover on downs where they had to go for it because they're already out of the game. I mean, I don't actually think the Jets played like a horrible offensive game. It's just that this is exactly why we talk about the way that Aaron Rodgers wants to play not being like feasible. You can't just go as slow as you want and limit your own possessions in a game and not run into this type of a game where you're 3-6. Speed up. Like, go win a game.
You certainly can't do it if you're not going to make some stops. And this was a crazy one because my experience watching this game, and partly in so many ways, I'm really jaded when it comes to Kyler Murray because, again, as frequent listeners know, live in Tucson. I'm a pretty big Cardinals fan. Love Trey McBride. I've been skeptical that Marvin Harrison is good as people talk about, but from a fan perspective, I would love it if he were that good. You're not seeing any of that. We joked about like Kyler Murray having one of the most egregiously bad plays of all time last week. So I watched him play this game where he completes 22 of 24 and appears to understand where his receivers are, gets the ball out quickly, averages over 11 yards per attempt. But then you kind of go back and you look at it, and the game was maybe not as dynamic as I was thinking. The 24 passes end up with 111 air yards. Now, some of that is because 8 of the 24 passes went for minus 25 air yards. Those would be the 7 passes to the backs and the 1 to Greg Dortch, right? But when you think about what the Cardinals did in this game, they essentially had every single play was a mini run or was an extension of the run game, as people like to talk about. James Conner, 91 yards after the catch. Trey Benson, 33 yards after the catch. Trey McBride, 25. Marvin Harrison, 19. You add that into what especially Trey Benson did on the ground. At some point, if you don't want to run your own offense fast, your defense has to get out there and make a tackle.
Yeah, that's not great. The Jets did have another long drive in the fourth quarter. They get the ball back with 11:08. They're down 31-6. The game's over. But they proceed to do a 15-play drive. They threw a pass on every single drive, but it goes from 11:08 on the clock to 4:47. I mean, you just go down inside 5 minutes. Takes over 6 minutes, almost 6.5 minutes a game clock to travel down and turn the ball over on downs. 15 straight passes. They finished this game with 55 plays, which is low. They had 40 going into that final drive. They were all pass attempts. Rodgers drops back on every single play. They wind up with only 17 rush attempts in this game. They went 55 plays as low, but when they were actually like willing to try to run the ball, they had 40 prior to that fourth quarter drive. And it's really those first couple drives of the game, those field goal drives, and then that one in the third quarter I mentioned that ends with the fumble, where they're actually establishing some offense and they did run the ball a little bit on those. They were a little bit pass heavy on those. My point is, if you have Breece Hall, you're really concerned about him. He actually looked great in this game. This is the thing that we've been talking about, though, since the offseason. Some concern about, again, these types of games. 4 catches on 4 targets for 31 yards does work out a little bit in his favor. We get a little bit of receiving. 10 carries for 52 yards is a really nice rushing line. Why did he only get 10 carries? Why did Braylon Allen get 7? People are going to ask those questions. It's not, I mean, he would have wound up dominating, I think, this split. The 10-7 is not meaningful to me. They did use Allen a little bit more, but I think just to sort of spell Hall, if they had opportunities to run the ball in the second half, they would have been back with Hall. Hall looked very, very good. I don't think Allen's coming for him really in any kind of a meaningful way. He did mix in earlier in the game. Like I said, they didn't run the ball in the whole fourth quarter. They literally did not have a rushing attempt in the fourth quarter. It's not like Allen's 7 rushes came in garbage time. They did not. But Breece Hall is a victim of the fact that they ran 40 plays in the first 3 quarters is really the way that I dig into that.
And the thing that I've been trying to tell people on this is that he's got a very favorable playoff schedule. That should be great. There's the potential for the Jets to go out and score a lot of points with Garrett Wilson and Davante Adams kind of as the driver of the offense through the air. This should be a hard team to match up with. But, I mean, the Arizona Cardinals, like I said, a rising team, but they are not a tough defensive matchup. I mean, if you're going to be good offensively, you just have to look a lot better than this. Breece Hall leads the running back position in routes. He's second in receiving yards. And yet the volume hasn't been there since Davante Adams was sort of incorporated into this offense. In this game, Adams has more than twice as many targets as Garrett Wilson. That's a problem in a number of ways. Obviously, it's not great for Wilson. I think it does indicate that defenses would prefer the ball to go to a washed-up Davante Adams as opposed to going to Garrett Wilson. They're going to try and funnel passes that direction. But there's also an element where they can throw underneath now to other guys, and Aaron Rodgers is going to feel like a pass to Davante Adams still has value. The other little thing here is that there were no goal line carries in this game, but Braylon Allen did get both of the sort of short yardage convert and keep the drive going carries. You'd like to think that that's going to be fluky. You'd like to think that when they get down there by the goal line, they want their best players in. I think that Breece Hall is just too good, and you watch him in this game, and he looked fantastic. Contextually, it's a pretty frustrating game, and there are, I think, some real danger signs.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not great. I mean, I come at this from the perspective of that I was way more on the Bijan than Breece side of things, so I've tried to be a little bit reasonable with this stuff. I sort of come at it like this is what I was concerned about, right? Like, and I don't want to sit here and start victory lapping, but I do think like, so anyway, as I was saying some of the favorable stuff and the volume was just low and all of that. I mean, I do think that is all very relevant. Breece Hall's still really good is the point. I mean, 83 total yards in this game where he barely got any opportunities. I mean, he gets 14 touches. He's a freaking Breece Hall. Like, what are we doing? Get him 20 plus touches. You should be making a big portion of the offense out of him. They are just trying to make the whole offense out of Davante Adams or out of Aaron Rodgers or what, right? So many of the targets for Adams, which, by the way, 13 targets, they go for 31 yards. Several of them are like little timing things that Rodgers is waiting or wanting him to see something pre-snap that he's not seeing. As I wrote this up in Stealing Signals this week, I was like, look, I mean, there is something to be said about how easy they made it look for all those years. What was so cool about that is that it's not that easy. No other quarterback and receiver combination that really could replicate that around the league at the time or since. I mean, I guess we've seen like Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp and some of these other guys have these really good connections at times. When you see that from a quarterback and a receiver, it's cool because it's unique. It's rare. It's tough to do what they did. The idea that they were going to be able to just step back into that and be at the same level they were at their peak in Green Bay when they haven't played together for a few years, probably not realistic. But we're seeing it's like they've never played together before. No communication whatsoever. Rodgers wanting him to do things and then throwing behind him. And he did this with other players too, where he winds up just throwing behind the player because he expected the player to see something pre-snap. And so it's just an incompletion. There's some of the option and read routes where he's clearly waiting to see it instead of like throwing with anticipation, and then the pocket's kind of collapsing. You're missing your windows. The timing and all of that stuff is just not there. He wants it to be very precise. He used to want it to be very precise. I remember, and I go back to the stuff with the Packers when they brought in that rookie class, MVS and Jamon Moore and whatever. You remember when they drafted like 3 of those rookies? I can't even remember who the third one is. It's another hyphenated name, I want to say. Who was the third? Do you remember? Marcus Valdes-Scantling, Jamon Moore. There's a third dude. Anyway, they like weren't playing these guys because they were not up to speed, and he was like mad at them in practices and stuff. And there, I mean, I can't remember if it was that exact rookie class or later or what have you, but there was all this stuff in the late years in Green Bay about how Rodgers basically didn't have tolerance for the rookies not being on the same page. And you think about that, and you think about the fact that the guys that were there was a foundation with them, whether that was Alan Lazard or it was Adams prior to that or what have you. It's not been, there is no foundation with any of these guys here. It's clear, right? He's not played with them. This is the first year to play with Garrett Wilson. And you kind of think about it, you're like, okay, it's not just the fact that he's coming off an Achilles. It's that there's not a lot of time on task here, right? Even with Adams, who, yeah, they used to, but it's been a lot of years since then. We do need to get some of this back squared away and sorted out and figured out. And they're trying to do all of it.
How difficult it is to execute those types of things in the current environment is one of the reasons that teams are approaching their offensive schemes differently. And, you mentioned MVS. He obviously has the out of nowhere big game for the Saints. And that one stood out to me in part because, Derek Carr is a very average quarterback, but it was interesting that last season he ranked number 5 in both IQR and points above average per attempt on passes that traveled 20 yards in the air. You think about, again, some of the efficiency numbers from Devontae Adams last season, which were not good, but you also think about why he wanted to play with Derek Carr and some of the things that Carr can do. I think we have some evidence both that Devontae Adams is not who he has been, and also that Aaron Rodgers cannot make the plays that you would need to be able to make. Right. And so I think the main thing for me is just that, when you fire the head coach, you change offensive coordinators, or you change a play caller. One of the things the owner is trying to do is light a fire under this team. They beat the Texans, and then they come out in this game with less urgency than maybe any franchise in the entire NFL. That just is unacceptable.
It's completely unacceptable. You have to play. Defensively, that's a whole different conversation. I think firing Robert Saleh has proven to be a disaster. If you look at the way that they actually had multiple games early on where they were really shutting some teams down, and essentially since that firing, teams are having their way with the Jets defense. They did a pretty good job against the Patriots, but every other team they've played since that firing has had 300 plus total yards. Even the Texans wind up losing that game. Stroud misses a couple throws in that game. There's an opportunity for even more yards and more scoring for the Texans. He misses John Mechie on a potential TD late in that game. Yeah, the Rodgers thing is, anyway, we don't need to spend a ton on Rodgers because I don't think we're really saying anything that people don't already know. It's just so clear that what he's trying to do is to recapture something that they don't have the time on task. They don't have it all figured out. The other name I was trying to think of, Sean, Equinemius St. Brown, Amon-Ra's older brother, was the third receiver in that Packers draft class. I think the name that actually, the stories I was talking about with the rookies and stuff that actually this applied to was Amari Rodgers, actually, a few years later, was never getting the playing time. And everyone was asking about it in the press conferences. And Rodgers was like, yeah, he just doesn't know how to do any of the stuff that I want him to do. Like, I basically don't want you on the field if you don't know all the things I want you to know. It seems like none of the players on the Jets know the things that Rodgers wants him to know. Mike Williams, by the way, was thrilled to score for the Steelers. He sent out a social media post and did a hashtag with the words red line, which is what Rodgers blamed him for the interception at the end of the Bills game a month back, because he didn't stay on the red line. Mike Williams threw a little shade by referencing the red line after his touchdown on his new team, the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Good for Mike Williams. I did think that was fun.
So, Jets suck. We were going to talk a little bit about Audric. I mean, one thing I will say is, if anything can be taken from this particular game, people have been saying the Rodgers stuff needs to change. They need to play with some urgency, etc. I think even he has a hard time denying it at this point, right? Like, you have a game like this where you don't get any play volume off at all. You can blame the defense so far. You got to start playing with a little bit more urgency. You got to start playing with a little bit. I mean, I'm hopeful that if we kind of needed to see them start to pick things up at some point.
Is that the takeaway, or is the takeaway that they ran a lot more plays than the Jacksonville Jaguars?
Jaguars ran 43 plays, had 100 and something yards of offense. That was a disaster. The Vikings were bad, but they were moving the ball downfield, and then Darnold was throwing us picks, and it didn't matter because the Jaguars couldn't do anything. It was 143 yards of offense, 87 net passing yards, which, by the way, was more than at least one other team. I can't remember who, but one of the teams that switched quarterbacks this week, Sean. Oh, the Cowboys. They didn't even manage to get 100 total passing yards between Cooper Rush and Trey Lance. Yeah, Jags were bad. Any big thoughts there? I mean, ETN played a lot.
No, I mean, just Mac Jones would tell you and be completely accurate that like there's no comparison between the team that he played on at Alabama that won the national title and the teams he's gotten to play for in the NFL in terms of the amount of talent they've surrounded him with. And not just at the skill positions, but on the offensive lines. So it's like, did I play poorly? Yes. Did I have any chance? Would Patrick Mahomes have done much in this game? Probably not.
Speaking of Mahomes, that's a game that I want to talk about. And we got Estime on the other side. We promised at the top we would talk about Estime. Mahomes misses Xavier Worthy for another deep touchdown. He's wide open. He throws it out of bounds. Feet are under him. Feet are set. Need the throw. I mean, he missed the deep post a few weeks back. You were frustrated with that. I think I was more like, look, this is a deep, deep pass, and he's kind of testing, Worthy's speed. The one that he missed this week is straight up the sideline. It doesn't require, and it's not as deep of a pass. It doesn't require the angle of a post. This is a throw that every quarterback should be able to throw. Their speedster is open up the sideline.
Did it kind of make you yearn for Russell Wilson? You're like, put it up there like a punt. Give your guy a chance. What are you doing?
I don't know that anything makes me yearn for Russell Wilson. It was very concerning to see from Patrick Mahomes. He hasn't played well this year. We've talked about it, but that's a throw that you just got to have. Then later in the game,
I don't know that you can always make that throw, but the thing that I keep comparing it to is I have this vivid memory, which I will always have, of Brady Quinn throwing a Hail Mary 15 yards out of bounds. That's the other play. Because again, the ball wasn't like barely. Xavier Worthy, so embarrassed from last week, did his darndest to make a play on the ball. And at some point he's just like, well, I'm dragging my feet and I'm extending and I'm going to look pretty silly as I crash into the ground here. And the ball is still just like way out there. I mean, right. Way out of bounds.
For anyone who didn't see it, what Sean's describing, Worthy did do a great job leaving his feet in and leaning way out of bounds to try to make this play. And he ends up hurting his shoulder on the play because he really tries to, I don't know if you saw that, but he jammed his shoulder, got up slow, did re-enter, but ended up being a little bit of a, you add injury to insult. You just throw him the ball and he scores a touchdown, but now you get your young player hurt. Look, Worthy's not been great. I'm not trying to defend him or anything, but now
there have been 3 easy long touchdowns that they haven't put in there. And the one, I mean, my concern would be that the one that's a mental mistake is on the rookie, and you don't want to see the mental mistakes, and it's easier to criticize that. But it's also easier to fix mental mistakes of like, if you're open deep, just don't walk out of bounds. I don't know how you fix a physical problem that Mahomes has where he can no longer throw the deep ball.
Yeah.
Unless, I mean, some of it, again, is just going to be very random. The deep ball is hard. but he loaded up on that one in order to throw the ball nowhere close to his receiver. And again, it's not just that. Like I mentioned that he missed Justin Watson wide open the previous week as well. I mean, they can get, I mean, it doesn't really sound like Hollywood Brown will ever play for the Chiefs. I'm not sure I understand that one, but that is my understanding. You know, you're going to get Rashee Rice back in future seasons. And yeah, I mean, he's mostly dynamic underneath, but that dude is a fantastic athlete who can get deep and probably will in his evolution. They're going to have Patrick Mahomes at some point surrounded by some real weapons. And right now, it looks like the only thing he can do is throw 2-yard passes to Travis Kelce. And when he was wide open in the end zone, he couldn't even do that.
I do think, I mean, I don't know. You said a few weeks ago maybe he's played his way out of the GOAT like label. At a point, it seemed like he probably was just better than Tom Brady. Obviously, he still has a long career to go, etc. But he's already won Super Bowls, multiple, 3, I think, right? And we have the potential for him to win as many or more than Tom Brady. And I know a lot of people say, well, wait for that to call him the GOAT. But he's done it at a young age. He's dominated the sport. He's done it with different types of teams and different players around him. But
and he's been a much more dynamic passer, and he's been a much bigger part of their victories than Tom Brady was. And right now, even though, again, some of the advanced stats suggest he's playing really well, and you look at this game he didn't play well. So many of the games, even with those misses, he's still a guy where the pocket presence and the understanding of the game is above everybody else. And
right.
That's arguably more important, but he's no longer fantasy viable, which is a crazy thing to say. And I mean, Bo Nix was so much better than him in this game. If you're Patrick Mahomes, that can never be true. It doesn't matter how good Bo Nix is. It can never be true.
So you said he can no longer throw the deep ball, which I think is a fair estimate, a fair representation of what we're seeing right now. I guess where I was going with it is this player, Mahomes, sort of playing himself out of that, but you'd like to think that he is able to find a fix. Like you said, that there's some variance elements. The reason I'm emphasizing this is like he missed the one a few weeks ago, and I was like, well, he's going to hit the next one. And then he missed I can't understand it. I'm having a hard time. But after that, 14-13, they're down by a point late in this game. There's 5 minutes left. They got to get a TD on this drive, or they're going to get upset at home by the freaking Denver Broncos. It's 3rd and 2 from the 2-yard line. There's 6:03 remaining. They're down 14-13. He extends the play a little bit, but he's not like off balance. He's thrown on the run a million times. And he's got Travis Kelce unguarded in the end zone and throws it to Travis Kelce's over his head. It's not even close. It's not even a catchable ball, and it should have been a touchdown. And again, they need that touchdown and a 2-point conversion to go up 7 and put themselves in a comfortable spot where they're turning the ball back over with 6 minutes left. Instead, they are forced to kick. You got to kick at that point. You're only up 1, you're down 1. You need to go ahead. They kick the field goal. They kick off. The Broncos execute the perfect 6-minute drive, get themselves down into field goal range, and have a 35-yard field goal to win that you have let them have because you couldn't throw about a 7-yard pass where Kelce was 5 yards deep in the end zone to the guy that you've thrown 100 whatever touchdowns to. And I mean, that was even a crazier one to me. The deep ball, you understand, the ball can sail. Maybe there's some wind up, whatever. I don't know. But the miss to Kelce in that spot, because he's usually so clutch. The big thing you could defend Mahomes with all year so far is, hey, on 3rd downs, he's been making these great plays, right? Like the people have shown that splits, his early down passing hasn't been great, but the dude locks in when you got to have it. He's a competitor, and I think his football IQ is way, way higher than most of the other QBs. It's one of the reasons he's the greatest quarterback of this generation, at least. He's so good at knowing I got to have this play, and I got to make sure I get it whatever way I can. I talk sometimes about the players that sail passes when players are wide open, when you just got to get the completion. And it can't happen on a 4th down or a 3rd down if a guy's wide open. One of the things Kyler Murray did that was really funny in this game after missing McBride last week, they do a leak play. McBride's wide open, and he just turns and chucks it way up in the air. You're talking about these Russell Wilson things. I mean, it was the highest. McBride stands there and fields it like a punt. but he was open enough that he could do that. And I've called for more quarterbacks to do this, and we get a 22-yard gain out of it. Yes, it takes so long to get over there.
McBride was looking, he's like, I'm going to go score a touchdown. And he's like, oh no, I'm going to take a couple steps back and catch a punt. Again, he was like cracking up about it.
Yeah. At least he got a 22-yard play. At least you keep the drive moving. Again, we just got done talking about how they got touchdown drives almost every drive. You don't go broke getting 20-yard plays is sort of the point. You do want to get a touchdown when the opportunity's there and the leak play works perfect. Mahomes missing that throw is just, anyway. I don't even know what tangent I was going off on. They give the ball back. I was saying that Mahomes doesn't miss those types of throws on big downs, on third downs. He understands you got to get the first down. You got to get the completion. He doesn't overthrow it. He doesn't overshoot it. That was such a key down in this game. 3rd and goal from the 2. You're down 1. You're going to have to kick. You have to get that play. Kelsey's wide open. He throws it over his head. And the exact thing you're fearing, that's the last play he touches the ball. Mahomes doesn't touch the ball again. The exact thing you're fearing is that Denver's got the right amount of time that if they can build the drive, they can run this clock out, even though Kansas City's got a couple of timeouts, and they can kick a game-winning field goal, and they can win 17-16, and they do all of that. And then the Chiefs block the kick, and the whole storyline changes, and everyone says the Chiefs are just doing what they can do to win, and they always find a way. But Patrick Mahomes deserved to lose this game.
He did. The Chiefs have to throw more passes. Kareem Hunt was completely and totally wiped out in the running game. He does get the 10 targets. Those aren't the types of passes I'm really looking for them to throw. DeAndre Hopkins, Xavier Worthy combined for 9 targets in this game. They only catch the 5 passes. One of the things I think it's important to note here is that the Denver Broncos are really good. And they now have a soft schedule. I think that they are going to go on a run. Bo Nix is playing extremely well. One of the things that happened in this game is that Cortland Sutton, who was fantastic overall, 6 for 70 with a touchdown, he drops a long completion where he's hit in stride. It's going to be a catch and run where they're going to get an easy field goal at the end of the first half to extend the lead. Obviously, the game would be played in a different way tactically from that point. So you don't know what would have happened, but certainly those points would have been very helpful for the Broncos. The Broncos have, one of the NFL's best defenses. They're going to be tough. I don't think that, having a loss at home to the Broncos actually would have been an embarrassing loss in any way, shape, or form. I do think that one of the things that is almost kind of weird considering what he's accomplished and how good the Chiefs are, but is also arguably kind of cool, is just like how excited Mahomes was after the blocked field goal, where you're like, this is a guy who enjoys playing, enjoys his team, and as opposed to be embarrassed about how he played in this game, he's just excited that the team won. I mean, especially when you're as good as Patrick Mahomes. I mean, even games like this, it's hard not to be embarrassed about how poorly you played, but that wasn't the takeaway for him. And I think that, I don't know, you expect him to bounce back. I would like to see it for him. I would like to see it for Worthy. But really the things that we should be focusing on is, again, just how well the Broncos played. Bo Nix, fantastic in this one. They are able to keep him from scrambling, which potentially hurt him a bit in the second half when they didn't move the ball as well. In the second half, their offense struggled outside of that final drive that should have won the game. But you think about what Cortland Sutton is now doing. You do get some little things from Vele again in this one. They actually decide to deploy Marvin Mims in the Deebo Samuel role, which, I mean, he's not going to be Deebo Samuel, but if you're trying to figure out how you can use someone like Mims, who's been a huge bust, and you don't have NFL caliber running backs, then I thought that part was actually kind of exciting. Not that it's going to turn Mims into a fantasy player. It's not going to, but it could be a little piece that helps their offense. But then they made the full move to Audric Estime this week.
Yeah, the Estime stuff, very exciting. I do want to say, I loved all your notes there. I love the competitiveness from Mahomes, the excitement for the block field goal. I did just actually go back and watch that last play after I described the whole thing. I mean, it wasn't too Travis Kelce's over his head. And he gets it out quick on the play. and Kelsey just like doesn't have time to jump. There's a scenario where if Kelsey had some athleticism, he can go up and get it, but he doesn't really have that at this age anymore. But again, still a horrible throw. It's not a good throw. I'm not turning around and defending it. Estime didn't play at the beginning of the game. We've been talking about Javonte struggling, I think, on the show. We've certainly been talking about it in articles and things. I wrote last week that it was interesting to me that Jaleel McLaughlin started. I went back and looked. Javonte had started every other game this year. Javonte still played his normal snaps in week 9. Whether his snap share has fluctuated, he's played between, I believe it's 39 and 45 raw snaps in every single game up until week 10. So 9 straight games have been in this like really tightly grouped range of like 6 snaps. They seem to just get him a certain amount of reps. And it's 35 to 42 snaps is the range that he's played every single game. Week 10, he played 17 snaps. Week 9 was the first game he didn't start, and McLaughlin did, but he came on right away. Week 10, he didn't start again, and McLaughlin came on, or excuse me, Javonte did come on in that first drive, and then they were using Marvin Mims out of the backfield. They give him 2 shotgun handoffs in the first quarter and also some passes out of the backfield. They're using him as like the, spread back when they're doing 4 wide, which was interesting. At least get Marvin Mims on the field.
Which was what I was saying while you were watching the Travis Kelce miss.
Okay, you mentioned that. All right, that makes sense. But look, I got more highlight watching in and was able to confirm something that I didn't need to confirm to the audience. So it's important that we repeat things as I'm very good at. At any rate, Audric Estime finally comes in later in the first quarter, early second, whatever it was, and then sort of takes off from there. Javonte Williams only plays 17 snaps in this game. He does still play on some third downs. I think going forward probably will still play on some third downs. Estime runs 7 routes. What we don't get is an increased role from Jaleel still. Like that's been a big part of why Javonte's continue to play is this, the pass down role and the unwillingness to use a smaller back, Jaleel McLaughlin, in different ways. Estime does have size. That's one of the reasons that we were kind of excited about him. That one of the reasons I was so confident in Javonte's role, which I mean, as I've written it up, Sean, I'm saying I'd make the bet again. He's just physically not going to be the player that he was. He had a really serious knee injury. We've seen J.K. Dobbins come back. We've seen some other guys come back. He had the resume that you would have thought that was possible, that if the knee wasn't completely shredded, that he could come back and be pretty decent. And I think the analysis of the role was spot on because we've gone 9 games and they've continued to use him even though he's looked horrible because they don't have any other option. That was the whole point, was the size and the ways that he does different things and plays on all 3 downs. How much they used him last year was a big part of what I talked about this offseason, was indicative of what Peyton wanted out of that lead role. Estime was the closest thing they had to potentially taking that. Now, Estime didn't do a lot in the pass game in college. There's some concern about that. He did run 7 routes in this game, doesn't get any targets. That's at least a small amount. It's 20-something% of the dropbacks. It's not nothing, right? Like it was more than Jaleel. Sure. It's close to what Javonte ran. But they did use Javonte throughout the rest of the game on some long down and distance stuff, almost like last year's Samaje Perine role, which is kind of what I expect for Javonte going forward now, is that he'll be last year's Perine, the clear passing downs. But Estime looks to have pretty clearly taken the early down rushing. And I was saying to you before the show, his first carry of the game, it came late in the first. The announcer, not really ready yet for Estime to have come on the field, he wears 23. Javonte wears 33. You see the 3 on the back, and he calls Estime Javonte. And I immediately go, ooh, there's some burst from Javonte. I literally started putting in my notes for Stealing Signals that Javonte showed something in this game. And then I realized it was Audric Estime. And so that's, I mean, as unbiased as it gets, Audric Estime just looked better than Javonte from his first touch. 8-yard gain. He gets a 6-yard gain on the next play. And that's just the 2 touches he had in the first quarter. They go to him in the second quarter. He has a 10-yard gain. That ends up being as long on the day. It's not like he had a massive rushing day or anything. And they did do a lot of passing. But to start the second half, first 2 plays, Audric Estime runs, right? To start the second drive of the third quarter, Audric Estime, then a pass, then Audric Estime, then Audric Estime again, right? In the fourth quarter, they used some Jaleel later in the fourth quarter to start that drive, to set up that game-winning field goal. Again, this is a game where they're in Kansas City trying to win. This is a major game. You're putting your best players out there to start that last drive we were just talking about, 6 minutes remaining. Audric Estime up the middle, only 2 yards. They get a first down a couple plays later. 1st and 10, Audric Estime for 3 yards. A couple plays later, 3rd and 1, Audric Estime for 6 yards. A couple plays later, they give it to Estime again. A couple plays later, Estime 2 more times. He has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carries on that last drive to set up that game-winning field goal. That's what Sean Payton, they needed to milk 6 minutes off the clock. They needed to get down into field goal range. Everything we just talked about. And what did they go to? They went to Audric Estime. I think it's very clear that this was a turning of the page where we're finally past the Javonte Williams early down rusher era, that Sean Payton was like, this is the game where I pull out all the stops. I go for the guys I want. That's why he was doing the Marvin Mims stuff. That's why we both brought that up. It was interesting to see that he's trying to put his best foot forward. He's trying to do whatever he can to win this football game. And clearly throughout the game is really where it happened, because it's not until the late first quarter that they even use Estime. And that's after, again, starting Jaleel McLaughlin, using Mims, using a little bit of Javonte. The fourth guy to touch the ball out of the backfield is Estime. And they're like, oh, yeah, clearly he had paths to being used more. But after showing something late first quarter, early second quarter, they start using him a lot more. They lean on him late. I think you expect him to start this week, and I think you expect him to get the bulk of the early down rushes going forward. The big question is, what is the ceiling? Does he get enough pass work? Does this offense start to actually be better for running back scoring than it's been? We've talked about, since the offseason, expecting more, and it hasn't been there, what we expected. Some of that could be from the players, right? If Estime can add some efficiency. But I don't think he's ever going to take over the whole backfield. Peyton likes his splits. I think he's still going to use Javonte, still going to use Jaleel a little bit, might do more of the Mims stuff. I kind of worry about the overall ceiling for Estime. I do definitely think he's worth chasing if you don't have an RB2 this week and you're looking for somebody to start. I mean, he feels like a 8 to 12 point guy, right? Like he's going to give you a solid startable RB2 number, but maybe not 20-point ceiling.
Yeah, it's going to come down to touchdowns, and I think this team is going to move the ball and they're going to score. And you would certainly expect him to be involved down by the goal line. One of the things that's been crazy is that for whatever reason, the Broncos don't like McLaughlin, who's been their most dynamic back in they don't like him in almost any context, but he's made all of these highlight plays down inside the 5. You wouldn't expect that to continue, because down inside the 5 is an area where you might want some size. He has the 14 rushing attempts in this game, and they only run 55 plays. So it's actually a pretty good chunk of it. I was giving the Chiefs a hard time for only having 8 drives, but they still ran 10 more plays than what the Broncos did. I mean, these teams both, somewhat effectively took the air out of the ball for both themselves, but also the other side. I think that we're going to see Broncos in a position in a lot of their remaining games to dominate time of possession if you have an elite defense, if you have a much more consistent running game, and then you have a quarterback who is operating like Bo Nix, where he's both throwing the ball well and in most games has demonstrated that ability to get out and extend drives with his legs. The Broncos could have a lot more plays than their opponents in many of the games going forward, which would be great for Estime. And then if you can execute the finish on those drives, you're going to get some goal line touches, which should be huge.
And even like I said, the 7 routes, and I got some feedback like he's not going to catch passes, and that's been sort of the thought and the knock on him and with his profile. The 7 routes, the reason I said it's nothing is when you start describing that version of the offense, like maybe they'll never throw 200 targets to the running backs like I had hoped for in this offseason, but they're going to do early down passes to their early down rusher. They will do some of that. They'll do some of the done with Javonte a bunch where they do like a play action, like a fake handoff, but then it's like a sprint out and they end up throwing it to the running back into the flat, right? Like Sean Payton loves that play where it's his lead back on 1st and 10. It's a fake and it looks like, Nix is going to throw downfield, but he just throws it to the running back out in the flat. That's not like a difficult play. It's not like Audric Estime needs to have some type of significant receiving skills or pass blocking skills. My point is it's an early down target. You don't even need to be able to play in the pass blocking situation. He'll catch some balls if he's the lead runner. If he's going to get 14 rush attempts in a game like he just did here, he'll have a couple catch, 2-catch games. It's not like he's going to have 0 catches, which I think some people were thinking. So yeah, as you describe that offense, that's just something else I want to throw in there. It's like, I do think Estime will get a few receptions as well, which can help the ceiling. And I think you're right. It does come down to touchdowns. If he's able to cap with some TDs, catch a couple balls, he can have 20-point upside. But I wonder, I don't think he has as much ceiling to be like a clear starter. At this point in the season, we're looking ahead to the fantasy playoffs. And as I was doing my Signals Gold this week, I was getting some questions about roster optimization for the playoffs and comparing Estime to some of these players where these teams are in good position and they're looking to get it, to the playoffs. How much should they bid on Estime, this, that, and the other thing? I mean, from one hand, you kind of just go after guys like this at this point in the season, regardless. But in terms of like, can Estime have a big enough ceiling, like on a weekly basis, where his expected role is good enough that you would start him over some, other strong plays? If you have a Tyrone Tracy on your roster or some of those plays, that's the one where I'm a little bit questionable. I think maybe he could be in the Tracy range, but probably not even quite there, I guess. Tracy played 80% of the snaps again. We'll see how the Giants offense limits him, but he's been pretty good.
If you have Drew Lock playing, then you may prefer any other player.
Yeah.
The other thing is that, if you have a very good team, but you're sitting on, Jordan Addison and Xavier Worthy as your flex option, then, you have to take into consideration what the 2024 season is giving you. And it may be giving you that if you have 2 running back spots, 2 wide receiver spots, and 2 flex spots, both of the flexes have to be running backs.
Right.
You got to figure out what you're going to do with that. Certainly if it's not tight end premium. And so having both, one of the reasons our teams are doing well is that they very consistently have 2 out of the 3 of McBride, Bowers, and Kittle. But if you're in a non-premium format or you don't have those players, but your team is still otherwise good, that lax flex spot could be the difference between winning and losing. There's still so much we don't know. Even when you look at this particular game, the thing that was fun is that Estime is big. And despite having a poor combine, the explosive runs in college were there. He talked about after this game that, if they're going to give me touches, I'm going to be a monster, which on the one hand is maybe over the top from someone who hasn't really done anything at the NFL level, but you love to see the confidence that you can go out and make those plays. The flip side of it is that in a game that I think everybody is very excited about, he doesn't average 4 yards per carry. Sports Info Solutions does not chart him with an evaded tackle, so no broken tackles, no forced missed tackles. And he gains more than half of his yardage before contact. So, this is a Chiefs team that is almost impossible to run against. And simultaneously, so much of his volume was in that final drive where the Chiefs kind of know what's coming. And so there are a lot of plays that are going to be schematically very difficult for the running back to do much. I think that's one of the reasons why you do end up with a 3.8 yards per carry. At the same time, the big plus plays actually look like broken scheme or broken execution by Kansas City. You're running through these big holes that mostly for the Broncos haven't been there. Now, I think that can work both directions. I always like to point out that yards before contact also matter. And if you have a running back with enough explosiveness to get into that hole, that's huge, right? Because Javonte Williams hasn't done it.
Do you think Javonte Williams would have had the same number of yards before contact if he got all those carries?
I don't think there would be as many. I think the one where somehow someone on the Chiefs blew an assignment, because you did have one of those, cliched, you could have driven a couple buses through the hole moments. And yeah, when Javonte, when Estime saw that, he's like, I'm going to run through that hole and then I'm going to hit somebody. Right. So yeah, you love to see that. I just think that this whole offense is rising. And that's one of the reasons why I even think the Mims thing is really cool. I don't know. I'm so excited about Nix and how he's playing that I can't really be that balanced in how I'm looking at this. But I do think that when, again, you have Sean Payton, right? And everybody's like, oh, Sean Payton is old. Andy Reid is also old. These guys are great, great coaches. Not everybody has to be Kyle Shanahan or Sean McVay. And thank goodness not everyone is. We want to see a few different things happening out there on the football field. It was so weird because I was so angry about the Patrick Mahomes performances that as somebody who, has grown up going to these Chiefs games, you're looking at the John Elway stuff. You have that Peyton Manning era. You go through all of those Lynn Elliott missed kicks. You go through the Marty Schottenheimer era. You go through the Dick Vermeil era. It's kind of crazy how fast you can get spoiled because I'm watching this game as someone who lives and breathes the Chiefs and hates the Broncos. And at the end of this game, when they blocked that kick, I was like, I don't know. That seems completely bogus. So
unfair. I love you said you can't look at it in a biased way as you're talking through Knicks. I mean, you've highlighted him a few times on the show already, and then a few times weekly the whole year. I think the listeners are aware that because they're sitting there going, "Are we watching the same Broncos team? These guys are 5-5. They're below average in points scored and yards per play." But look, they're 5-3 since those first two games that were a disaster. They could be 6-2 since then. If they just make this kick and they beat the Chiefs, they've been.
And two of the losses were the Ravens and the Chiefs.
Yeah, right. And Chargers are the other one. Chargers are a tough team.
I think he had to be
Chargers.
I'm not turning around on the Chargers.
I want to talk about them.
Justin Herbert looks good.
Justin Herbert looks good. They didn't throw a whole lot in this game. They got Gus Edwards back, and they ran a ton. Even in a run matchup, they had a really negative pass rate over expected. Herbert only throws 18 passes. They use Herbert as a schemed runner in this game. Down in the red zone, 4th and 1. They call it QB sweep. He gets a 4-yard touchdown run. Pretty fun play. Gus Edwards returned, looked way better than earlier in the season. I wanted to contrast him with what we were talking about with Estime because he's not going to catch passes. Like he might catch 1 or 2. But like you've got 10 carries here for 55 yards. A couple things to note. A lot of people are still asking about Kamani Vidal. I talked about him a little bit in the newsletter this week. I think it was a fine play to make. He had his opportunity. They put Edwards on IR. You can think whatever you want to think about that. I choose to think that Edwards' injury didn't happen on a clear play or anything. It was a little bit of a phantom thing. It almost felt like it was after the bye. We heard about it, and they put him on IR. I choose to believe that they're like, okay, we're going to set Edwards aside, let him get healthy. He probably was dealing with something. Let him get healthy for later in the season. Maybe he comes back and he's an effective player, but it also gives us an opportunity to give Vidal an opportunity, which I think they wanted to find a reason to do. Teams tend to do that when veterans aren't performing. They want to get their young players opportunities. They gave him his opportunity. He never really cracked into Dobbins' usage or playing time. That includes, he was then also getting more work in practice with the first team and those types of things. Clearly they were not seeing something that they really wanted to see. But I still think that it was, with the profile that he has and everything, a worthwhile bet to make, similar to the one I talked about with Javonte. I wrote about these things in the intro to part 1 of Stealing Signals this week. More, on my thoughts there, if you're actually curious and don't think it's just me sort of beg defending or what have you. But the point is, at this point, Vidal goes back to inactive. Edwards comes back, and Edwards gets 10 carries. He cuts into Dobbins, and we actually do see that they want to limit Dobbins if they can a little bit, or they're open to the idea of another back playing a little bit and not necessarily. Dobbins has 15 carries and catches 3 passes, plays on all the pass downs in this game. But I do think it's interesting that Edwards immediately got 10 carries. Vidal didn't get probably 10 the whole 4 games that he was on IR combined. And so I think it tells you something about what they learned about Vidal. And I think the flip, so you can cut Vidal was the point. And then Edwards is one that is worth noting right now because he comes back and he runs effectively. He actually looks pretty decent. His downhill style, but he's running a little bit harder, it looks like, at this point, maybe a little bit healthier. Gets 55 yards on 10 carries. I do think going forward, they're going to continue to use him. There's the potential for him to have the 60-yard and touchdown type of game, but he's probably not going to catch a lot of passes. It is a limited profile. It's more of a non-priority bid. But again, if you need running back points, I think Edwards now becomes a guy to consider. Dobbins is going to play on the pass downs. I think that's what's clearly going to happen. I think it's possible that Edwards actually starts getting like more rush attempts than Dobbins in some of these games. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, I want to contrast him with Estime, where Estime, I think, actually has that is upside Estime does have, is the ability to catch some passes and do a little bit more, even though he's also in a committee. There's slightly different types of committees.
Well, I think that gives a good example too of where you might want to continue churning your roster in a way that gets you prepared for another shoe that drops in a way that isn't favorable. So another thing that we have on some teams, and I certainly have on some teams by myself, are very good rosters with J.K. Dobbins. He may not be playable for a truly elite roster, a team that's trying to win $1 million or something like that in the fantasy playoffs. Estime probably isn't exactly either, but the problem that you now have where Dobbins simply actually has not been very good over the last month, arguably just from those first couple of games. You have the big back. You have a guy who scored a lot of touchdowns. You have an offense that, not this year, but in the past, one of the reasons why they signed him, the reason that so many people drafted him. And you have Justin Herbert playing really well, even with very weak receiving weapons. This is a team that it would not be surprising if they have a lot of goal line touches the rest of the way. If Edwards takes those, then you've got to break some plays in the receiving game because, one of the things you look at Edwards right there is he plays very well. 10 carries, 55 yards. He looked big. He didn't look fast, but he looked big, physical. He looked like Estime, someone who could run downhill, which isn't at all the way he looked early in the season. It's not startable at all in fantasy. But then again, if you get to the point where you're starting to get comfortable with the idea that they're going to have goal line touches and it is going to be Edwards, then yeah, you can still get a 10 carry, 55-yard gain and be really out in the cold in terms of your fantasy scoring, or you can get 2 touchdowns on that and suddenly it works. You're going to have to make some tough decisions depending on your roster at some point later in the season. Then on the other side of the field, you get an interesting one as well, where Tony Pollard is averaging 15 EP per game. I think you can make the claim that being only 1 point underwater in terms of fantasy points over expected is actually a pretty strong performance within the context of what the Tennessee Titans are making their players deal with from an offensive perspective. He has been a little beaten up recently. We finally get Tyjae Spears back in this game, and Pollard does miss a little bit of time within the game, which allows Spears to get some run. It's not on any kind of sample that's going to make you say, oh, this dude, definitely is awesome. But you think back to what Spears did last year, and then you look at his week 10 performance, or on a points above average per attempt basis, he ranked as the number 1 back in football. He had 3 evaded tackles on his 7 carries. He gains 47 yards. They split the routes equally. Pollard has been good enough, and when you're as good as he has been, and the team made that contractual commitment to him before the season, made the point to bring him in, I think you can very clearly count on Pollard to be the guy if he's healthy. But this is another situation where if either of these 2 guys gets injured from this point again, then the leftover player actually is probably going to score very well. Both of these guys are talented. If they can get Will Levis or Mason Rudolph to just be bad instead of flat out awful, then I think that the other player here can score some points. So I think you have to look at Pollard in a similar way that you're looking at J.K. Dobbins, where it's not great, but still plenty of upside for both players. Arguably more upside than for either Edwards or Dobbins, because both of those guys are more talented than both of the Ravens backs. Ravens, we have that Ravens connection. Both of the Chargers backs, the offensive situation, much better in Los Angeles.
But you can argue some of the receiving stuff is meaningfully better in Tennessee. They combined for 7 catches, Spears and Pollard in this game. And Callahan's been talking about that since the offseason and has been willing to throw to the backs. Yeah, I wanted to note on the Edwards goal line stuff. It was interesting. They did the Herbert sweep on a 4th and 1 from the 4, and that became a touchdown. And they also used Hassan Haskins right at the goal line again, and he got the other rushing TD. So you get 2 rushing TDs inside the 5, and it's neither Edwards or Dobbins. I do think it will likely be Edwards or Dobbins going forward. Maybe a little bit of Haskins still, but Haskins has been poor at those plays, and they kind of use him out of a fullback alignment. I think it's going to be too predictable. We'll see with the Edwards stuff. I think it was a great breakdown, but I just wanted to throw in that context about what happened with the short yardage in this game. And then, I think a great breakdown on Spears as well. The little contextual note that I wanted to throw out, because I did call it noise, the actual usage. You talked about the routes and the snaps. I called it noise in this game. The context, which you mentioned, is that Pollard gets banged up with about 10 minutes left in the second quarter. Spears plays the rest of the half. So the rest of that drive, the following drive, and then he also gets a carry with 4 seconds left. They do one play. He gets a 19-yard run against a soft defense, which is kind of nice for him to pad the stats a little. But he got a bunch of touches the rest of the second quarter. Pollard didn't return to the game, returned after halftime. They talked about on the broadcast that he was going to be good to go after halftime, but he had gone back to the locker room to get checked out. Or actually, I'm not certain he went back to the locker room, but they were talking about it. They were doing those sideline reporting during that period in the second quarter. Pollard does play a decent amount in the third, but then also late, because he was banged up and because this became a 27-10 game, Spears played the whole final drive, for example, had 4 touches on the final drive. Pollard didn't see the field, I don't think, on that final drive. They're like, okay, well, we're not going to keep pushing you in a game where you already left and then re-entered. And so you do get a pretty clean 50-50-ish split. I'm a little bit hesitant, but I still think everything you said about Spears looking good.
I think that Pollard is going to be the guy.
Yeah, you said that.
And in this game, 51 plays for the Titans. You have to run more plays.
Right. And so that's the other thing I was going to go to, which is so fascinating, because you said about good play, that they got to get it from the quarterback. Will Levis, 18-23, 175 yards, 2 touchdowns, a passer rating of 127, 5 rushes for 41 yards as well. We see some mobility. He actually looks vaguely, he took 7 sacks, but he looks vaguely competent in this game.
7 of their 51 plays were sacks.
But no, the reason I say he looks vaguely competent is I want to point out something, and I did this in Signals, that I wrote in the offseason Stealing Signals, which was that a lot of people were excited about this team having more pass volume, right? And more play volume. They're going to play up tempo, and Brian Callahan was going to bring a different type of game to the Titans. What I wrote was that Mike Vrabel last year covered up a lot of warts. I felt like for this offense, in some ways, was a good coach that maximized stuff for his players and did things low volume intentionally to cover up warts, and that this scheme was more or less going to try to put them on display, and it was going to be a problem. I think what we just saw, Sean, when you talk about the limited number of plays they had and everything else, it was basically Brian Callahan saying, I got to at least have something that I can build on. I can no longer try to win the game in front of me. Will Levis, you got to hold the ball. You got to take the sacks. You can't throw the ball away. He winds up with a superficially great stat line, and yet, as you're pointing out, they barely ran any plays. They score a touchdown on their first drive. They go down on, first 15 or whatever. They go down 72-yard touchdown drive. They don't score again until there's less than a minute left. That first drive, great post pass. Levis did stand in there and throw a really good pass to Calvin Ridley for a TD. Ridley has a 2-touchdown game because he scores again with 54 seconds left to turn a 17-point deficit into a 10-point deficit. The definition of garbage time is what I'm getting at. And Levis, they score 3 points in the gap between their first drive and their last drive. They had 7 other drives, 4 punts. One of those was just that end of half Tyjae Spears run. One of them was a missed field goal. They could have potentially made 2 different field goals. But my point is, they were very conservative on a lot of their down and distance play calls. They were and the sacks don't help these drives either. I mean, they're a huge problem for these drives. But ultimately, my read in this game was, again, that Brian Callahan was back to doing it the way Mike Vrabel was doing it last year, which is, I got to find a way to build up some confidence in things so that maybe I can win a game a different week, because I'm definitely not going to win the game this week. I can't have him just dropping back and chucking the ball around, even though that was their only chance to win this game, was to be more aggressive than they actually were, because that would have went horribly. So instead, you wind up with Will Levis actually looking good in the stat book as a result of doing suboptimal things to try to win the game in front of you.
Well, they're going to play the Vikings next week, which is going to look very similar to this game, although Sam Darnold may make enough mistakes that both teams will just look identical. Then you have a game at the Texans. That'll be a tough matchup. You have a game at the Commanders. They're going to have 3 more games here. They're likely going to be 2-10, and Will Levis is likely going to only not get benched because you have to run out the string and see what he has. You do have some opportunities down the stretch. You get to play the Jaguars twice. Against the Jaguars, you may be able to start Tyjae Spears. Hold him all season for those 2 Jaguars games.
I love it. I do think I mean, again, one of the things that they're doing with the lack of aggression in this game, I mean, it actually kind of hurts. Ridley has a 2-touchdown game, but it kind of hurts Ridley a little bit. They only throw 23 times in a blowout loss, right? I mean, that's bad, right? He's been getting so much volume. He gets 9 targets is all in this game, and a couple of them are late in garbage time, including that late touchdown. But what you do get is you get those 7 completions to the running backs out of 18 total completions. I mean, that's too many, again, in a game where you're trailing by this much. But that's what they're going to do. They're going to. So, I mean, yeah, I agree with you. I think the Tyjae Spears play could be fun late in the year when they're just trying to look competent at times.
Again, you it's just impossible as a human being to look at all of the games in the exact same way. Levis played poorly. Mac Jones played poorly. Caleb Williams played poorly. Certainly out of those 3 players, the person who had, like you're explaining, the most superficially promising game was Will Levis. He was also the one of those 3 guys where the sacks looked like they were almost exclusively on him. Now, that's not to say that on the non-sack plays that Caleb Williams or Mac Jones weren't far worse than Levis was. But in terms of responsibility for sacks, I didn't see what those other 2 guys could do. Will Levis, you got to be ready to avoid some of those plays. You got to get rid of it. Yeah, I mean, maybe
you think that's sort of
you got to get rid of the ball. I don't know. I mean,
don't you think it's some of that's coaching where it's like, look, you've made enough ridiculous plays. Like, you got to just take the sack. And now he's going too far the other way, probably. He doesn't strike me as a very smart human being. He eats mayonnaise out of the jar. I don't know how many times I've said this on the show, but
if you can eat mayonnaise and you can do the splits, throw the ball away. I don't know. I mean, I think that if you can't throw the ball away, you can't play quarterback at the NFL level. I like Will Levis. I don't think he can play football, but
yeah, no, I mean, he's probably a great dude. I think he played like the mayonnaise cologne that he had earlier this year. The willingness to,
how can you not love Will Levis and Gardner Minshew?
Yeah,
I mean,
mayonnaise cologne. You're gonna lean into it a little bit. I love it. I'm good with that part of it. Just trying to give an honest assessment. There's people that are Will Levis truthers out there on Twitter, Sean, they were pretty into the Titans. Titans were, yeah, they were very cheap, but there was a lot of people that were like, this is a good cheap bet to make. And some best ball stuff, late stacks and things like that. And it just, it hasn't panned out. Obviously, I'm not trying to like throw, rub salt in the wound or anything, but you start to see Levis have a stat line like this: 41 rushing yards, 175 pass yards, 2 TDs, no turnovers. He did fumble, but he didn't lose it and didn't throw a pick. And I just want to emphasize he took 7 sacks and they played very conservatively to basically make him look half decent. I just don't want people to make the same mistake again, is what I'm getting at. I mean, I know that sounds very arrogant, but I think if you watch the game, you don't think, and you're saying it too, as the way the sacks were on him.
The games that you're looking for if you buy into Will Levis. And one of the things that we are seeing is that it's very tough for the pass-oriented QBs to score effectively in fantasy. So I can certainly understand. I mean, I understand the path to it, but one of the things that 2024 is telling us that I do think is equally important, if not much more so, is that the ability to play matters. You can't throw a Will Levis and Anthony Richardson out there in fantasy if they're going to get benched, if they're mostly not going to score because they're simply not anywhere close to being NFL level starters. Maybe they'll get better. I mean, the Colts going back, one of the things that you were joking with me about a little bit last week, Ben, is that probably no one has been more skeptical about Anthony Richardson, and yet I added him to a handful of our teams last week. And I'm not excited about it because I also have a lot of Josh Downs. And you're like, what? Josh Downs looked great. Not great. I mean, he drops the key play, but I mean, he is a star. Mitchell looked fantastic in that game. Pierce scores a bunch of points in that game. I mean, I want to be able to play the receivers.
Oh, yeah.
But if things somehow magically improve for Anthony Richardson, we're going to be plugging him into some of those lineups in week 17 and winning.
Sure. I mean, he still has big scoring potential. The one thing I'll circle back on is you said this is the type of game you're looking for from a Will Levis. I think my whole point is it was not. It was in terms of maybe fantasy scoring or the superficial stats, but this doesn't scale. The 23 pass attempts comes with 7 sacks. You have to be able to actually get the ball out. The good quarterbacks, they don't end up with 23 pass attempts in this type of a trail situation. They get passes off in those spots, which hurts their pass efficiency in some cases, but also boosts the overall volume, and it allows them to throw for 250 or more pass yards in a game where they trailed pretty much throughout and had an early long touchdown pass, mind you, right? And then he did basically nothing after that. 41-yard TD pass on the first drive, and then he has 134 passing yards for the remainder of the entire game. Only 5 incompletions, Sean. Some of them were some of the worst incompletions you'll see, right? Like, I was surprised that he was 18 for 23 because I had it in my notes and I went back and watched. His incompletions were bad in this game, man. They're way off again. Like, it's the same thing as Richardson. It looked like Trey Lance was going to look that way too. We might get to see a little more Trey Lance this year. Reminded me of Richardson and Levis and Drew Lock, who you mentioned a little bit ago. These guys with big arms where the ball could go anywhere. No idea where it's going to go. The one thing I was telling people were asking me, what do I think could happen with Drew Lock? I mean, one of the things when you have a huge arm and you don't know where it's going to go, but it's a small enough sample size and you have guys like Malik Neighbors, sometimes it does go the right spot and you actually can look good for a couple of weeks or something like that. I could see Drew Lock. Remember when Will Levis's first start last year was 4 touchdowns and he tricked everyone into thinking he had accurate ball placement down the field?
I mean, it's always possible. For me, it's tough because unlike Richardson and Will Levis, Drew Lock can read the field. He can go through his progressions. He can find the guys. I think he's less accurate. I know that's almost impossible to believe. I think he's less accurate than those guys.
It's a fair distinction. It's a good distinction.
The 3 players in the NFL with lower points above average per play on passing plays than Gardner Minshew are Deshaun Watson, Will Levis, and Anthony Richardson. So again, it's not just that like we're not on those guys. The actual on-field product has been Deshaun Watson level bad.
Let's talk about some good quarterbacks, but aren't necessarily scoring. I got some questions about Jayden Daniels this week.
Is anybody going to score against their fantasy?
No.
Thank goodness for Joe Burrow.
Right. We got Joe Burrow on our guillotine team, which is still alive. We have $3 left on our guillotine team. I was giving Sean crap about it. I got to tell you guys about the anxiety that he gives me. 1-2 big bids on Jahmyr Gibbs and JSN. Not quite sure why the total that he added it up to left $3 when it could have left, I don't know, like 10 or something. But that's where we're at for the rest of the way. The listeners that are still alive.
That one has first come, first serve. So I'm pretty disappointed that we have any money. I have been in the position where a couple of our awesome FFPC main event teams, where there's no first come, first serve. You have to have dollars to make moves. We're in that 10 to 15 range.
Yeah. And in past years, you did it where we got down to about $3 at this point. And I'm like, Sean, you really, in week 11, want to only have 3 potential moves the rest of the year? We had a team a couple years back where we needed to make a move and we needed to make 2 moves and we had $1 left or something. And it was like, I'm the cautious one in this arrangement.
And then we were in the top 5 going into the last.
Yeah, game. I know.
Worked out.
You've been doing this.
Maybe that other move was the one that got us there.
For me, it's like, man, I just want to have the potential, right? Like I don't feel like the extra couple bucks on the bid last week was necessary to get us to 3 when it could have got us to 13 or whatever. But anyway, this is couples counseling will be our next stop. This is not necessarily what we need for the.
We were going to have a little more money in our FFPC main event. I was taking them back down. But it was for Drake May on one of these teams that none of the quarterbacks score. That's like, no, push it back up. We got to have Drake May.
We did. And we got Drake May. But you also had a bit on a kicker on that one. We took the kicker.
Jake Moody. 3 field goals this week. You know how many points that is? That's a lot. You don't have to worry about how many they miss.
He made 3 in addition to missing 3. Yeah, That is good. Anyway, the audience is like having a hard time following along. We're like speaking in code about our past conversations. Jayden Daniels, I got some questions about, what's going to happen. Is bad, this and the other thing. You made a comment to me prior to the game about how great things have been for Lamar with how bad the Ravens defense is. It has really sparked some stuff for Lamar. several weeks ago, we talked about Jane Daniels on the show, and I talked about him as the fantasy QB1 going forward, specifically because of what Lamar's gotten. That his defense was going to be so bad that it was going to force him to have to make a lot of those types of plays, and he showed that he was good enough to do it. Daniels has been on the other side of that spectrum. His defense has not played necessarily terrible. They struggled a lot in this game offensively against Pittsburgh, and yet their defense actually created some short fields and some opportunities for them. They were out in front for a lot of the game. They were up by 10 late in the game. They should have won this game. They do not. Steelers end up taking it late, kind of steal a win, frankly, relative to, sort of the way the late game stuff went. I don't have it all necessarily memorized from this game. Jaylen Warren did have a fumble at the 1 yard line that cost the Steelers an opportunity where you could argue that the Commanders may have stolen one if they were going to be able to take care of it. Oh, the play that we talked about pre-show was after the Steelers had scored. All Daniels had to do was get him into field goal range. They wind up with a 4th and 9 because of a couple missed opportunities with Noah Brown. Daniels hits Zach Ertz right at the sticks. I think it should have been ruled a first down. We get a replay review. They mark it short. You and I are talking before the show. I mean, if Zach Ertz is on this roster, the one thing that he needs to do is to get to the sticks on a 4th down. When I saw him catch that, I was like, all right, good. Like, that's literally the only reason you have a 90-year-old Zach Ertz on the team is he's got the veteran savvy to run his route to the sticks on 4th down. Jane Daniels can't see the sticks from there. He sees the open receiver. It is the receiver's job to run that route to the sticks. Zach Ertz did not do it. You're not going to get any yards after the catch. We know that. You just fall down. So run your route to the sticks. Didn't do it. They get short by inches on 4th down, turn the ball over at the Pittsburgh 42.
In his defense, you also want the officials to know where the sticks are and where you are relative to them.
It would have been great if they marked that as a first down because it was close enough to have been marked as a first down. Sean, you expressed that before the show as well. I believe you think that it should have been marked as a first down. I think it was really, really close. That would have put them at the 42 of Pittsburgh across the 50. And essentially you're talking about not even needing another first down. I mean, if you just get 6 or 7 yards there, you're kicking a long field goal. Hopefully you can continue to move the ball. There's a minute and 18 seconds left at that point. Steelers were able to then run the clock out. Man, I mean, I forgot about this as well. They got the 3 timeouts, and on a potential punt, they line up to go for it. They get a neutral zone infraction on 4th and 1 and give the Steelers a first down to kneel it out. They could have at least got the ball back and given Daniels a minute with no timeouts to potentially make something happen, and he probably could have. I mean, he's freaking great. Anyway, he winds up with 200 pass yards, no touchdowns, and really limited rushing in this game. It's a weak fantasy score, and people are concerned. Number one, we were just talking about how the defense has played better, and it has changed the math a little bit, which is not great. But number two, I do want to note, this isn't ideal, but there was 3 1-yard rushing TDs in this game for guys other than Daniels. That's not going to be the case in every week. He does on one of these sequences hit Terry McLaurin on a catch and run slant, and he put it right on him. It goes for a huge play. McLaurin just doesn't quite have the angle, but in some scenarios, potentially that's just a long touchdown, but he's not able to house it. A little bit later on that drive, hits McLaurin again, catches a slant, gets down to the 1. I mean, could have been a pass TD twice on that drive to McLaurin. Instead, it ends up being the 1-yard rush TD. A little bit later, he hits De'Ami Brown right in the hands in the end zone, and he just drops the football. So Daniels had multiple opportunities for passing TDs in this game. He also, as you were saying to me before the show, will likely factor into the rushing touchdown equation more in the future than he has. And the 5 rushing yards, I mean, that's just a straight up anomaly. He has not had another game under 22 all season, including the game he got hurt in right away. The vast majority of his games have been 50 plus or, 40 plus. I guess I'll say 35 plus. Every other game is 35 plus. He has one game at 22. Every other game is 35 plus, and then 5 this week rushing yards. But you're going to get some rushing yardage out of him in most games as well. The Steelers are a good defense, and they probably had a good plan. They're probably spying him. I don't know, the whole element. He's got some better matchups coming up. Next week, a little bit of a tough one against the Eagles as well, but Cowboys, Titans are a pass funnel a little bit. Some matchups coming up that a little bit more favorable, I think. I don't know. Anyway, I guess my take is that Jayden Daniels is fine. I have no issues whatsoever with Jayden Daniels. It's maybe not quite as compelling if the defense is playing a little bit better like it is right now for Lamar. And I would take Lamar rest of season over Daniels for those reasons.
Yeah, the matchup here made a big difference. I think it's mostly encouraging because this is the best. It's one of the best combinations of how Terry McLaurin has looked and the volume actually being there for McLaurin from a yardage perspective. Now, you don't want Ertz to have more targets than McLaurin. You don't want Brown to have more targets than McLaurin. You don't want Noah Brown to look awful, which he did in this game. And one of the things that's been kind of a stealth fun story is that Noah Brown, off of having obviously played some decent games last year for the Texans, has done some solid things here. For Daniels to get where he's eventually going to be, they have to add some more talent around him. His receivers outside of McLaurin were awful in this game. But you combine that with the Pittsburgh Steelers pass defense and the fact that they still more or less controlled this game. You mentioned sort of where they were at, and there were a bunch of different points throughout the second half where they were 80+% to win in terms of the win probability models. You also look at this game in terms of how it did develop. The Steelers ended up running 75 plays, and that part is vaguely interesting when you contrast it to so many of the teams we talked about, specifically from week 10, where their play totals were extremely low. There was a 16-play gap just between the two teams in this particular game. Because they ended up running a lot of plays, they were able to get both of their running backs involved. And man, if this game, or this season, I should say, has been frustrating for you with Jaylen Warren, I think this one maybe, you're finally going back in the other direction where Warren just looks night and day better than Najee Harris. Now, it's
Harris is having a career year right now. Harris is, but this looked like every other time prior to 2023, where those two guys have been on the field together, where we've just constantly talked about how Warren just looks better. Flat out.
So much better. And it's tough for Harris because SIS, they charged him with 5 more evaded tackles. He's evading tackles at a crazy rate. But even with that being the case, only 1.8 yards after contact. So Harris is a guy who can evade a bunch of tackles and not generate a bunch of yards. That part is problematic. You contrast that with Jaylen Warren. He breaks 3 tackles on the 13 carries and then is sort of off to the races, right? He leads the position in boom rate. Now, again, that's on just a tiny little sample. It basically means you had a couple of good runs. But a couple of good runs are meaningful for a team that does lack explosiveness, that is basically just, we're going to call a bunch of plays that have no purpose other than eating clock and punting. We're going to rely on the defense, and we're hope that George Pickens makes enough circus catches in the game to win the game. If you add Jaylen Warren onto that, and you have the additional explosiveness in the run game, then I think you start to have a game here too, where in terms of at least how SIS charts it, 13 routes for Warren compared to only 5 for Harris. Now that fumble could have very easily been the difference maker in the game, which, that's going to be problematic potentially for the coaches. And as you mentioned, Harris is having a career season. All of those things should limit Warren, who has been very clearly injured. It's sort of similar to the Gus Edwards situation, not because those two guys are similar themselves, but because relative to where they generally are, they were clearly not that earlier in the season. Warren looked great in this game. I think that he's another back who could be someone where if your overall roster was set up to where you didn't really need him, you haven't been playing him, but he's stashed, he could be pretty fun the rest of the way.
Definitely. I thought he looked, and just, coming off a bye and having been banged up earlier, just a nice run out. A good first game post bye to see from him as he gets a little bit healthier. Completely agree there. That game was weird. You talked about the significant number of play volume for the Steelers. Commanders didn't hold the ball well. That is something that does need to be said here, but it is a tough matchup. But they punted several times. They also had, several scoring drives as well. But their first touchdown drive, only a 15-yard touchdown drive off of a fake punt that the Steelers tried early in there, which they had wide open, and the guy just dropped the ball. So they get a short touchdown. They had a couple longer touchdown drives later in the game, but in their first 4 drives, they had 3 3-and-outs and that short touchdown drive. And then multiple more 3-and-outs in the second half. There were some times in this game weren't great. Steelers end up running a lot of plays. Like you said, 14 possessions. We were talking about possessions in part 1 this week. This was a game this might have been the game you're referencing that had all the possessions.
It must have been.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not a big believer in the current version of Russell Wilson, but it is a great fit. And the overall roster works. I mean, I think the Steelers are at least as big a threat to the Chiefs as the Bills or the Baltimore Ravens.
That surprises me. I don't think they are.
They're not.
Yeah. I mean, I think they've looked good. And I gave Arthur Smith some credit in the write-up this week, which is stealing signals first. I think the offense has actually looked really good in Pittsburgh basically all year. I thought they did a really good job with Justin Fields earlier in the year and was saying that Fields looked better in a Smith system and Smith's system looked better with Fields. And now he's gotten a lot out of Russell Wilson in addition to that. And he's got some players on this team that aren't necessarily good players, right? Like, and the scheme is still they're playing a lot of Van Jefferson still. And I don't understand it. He's not a very good. He didn't make some competitive plays on his couple targets in this game. I've given him a lot of crap over the years, but it really is somewhat bizarre that he's still out there like playing a lot for NFL teams at this point because he's not good. Like it's been a running bit, but he's not good at football. Seems like an awesome dude. Everyone seems to really like him as a person. The beat reporters that cover it, etc. His dad played in the league and coaches in the league. There's a lot of. I mean, I think that's why he plays a lot because he's a really good person. Presumably,
there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah, there is.
So I'm going to be higher on the Steelers in general. I'm going to be lower on Arthur Smith than what you're describing.
Well, I mean, I don't know how. Then, so are you high on Wilson? Because Wilson, I mean, 14 for 28 in this game. He's completed fewer than 60% of his passes on the year. He's basically just had some explosive plays. He's only started 3 games. People think Russell Wilson's back. He's had 3 good games. And one of the things, like people saying he's brought George Pickens back. George Pickens looks incredible. I think he legitimately might be one of the 10 best receivers in the league. I think I mentioned that to you on the show a couple weeks ago. Is he like up there in the conversation with the top 5? This is an awesome play after awesome play. At the same time, you can't say that Russell Wilson unlocked George Pickens through 3 games when the vast majority of the production has come on big plays that, I mean, it's hard to like, how is this sustainable? How are these plays going to continue to happen? He's going to have some down games. You can't consistently make ridiculous plays work over and over and over again. But they've done that for 3 games. And I guess I'm saying I feel like too much of the production has been on the razor's edge. When I reference the completion percentage and some of those things, some of the Russell Wilson stuff hasn't necessarily been great. And then he's thrown these big high bombs and they've hit. So anyway, where are you high on the Steelers if you don't think it's, if it's not Smith?
The defense, Mike Tomlin, Jalen Warren, George Pickens. Also, I watched this Buffalo-Indianapolis game, and it's like if Joe Flacco would stop throwing it directly to the Bills, the Colts would have won that game easily.
Easily.